Racist cop kills decorated war hero. What the court did next shocked the nation. The road stretched ahead like a ribbon of calm beneath the golden light of late afternoon. Colonel Elijah Carter sat behind the wheel of his black BMW 7 Series, the engine humming softly as he guided it along the quiet roads of Willow Heights. The neighborhood was pristine, lined with manicured lawns, towering trees, and homes that seemed to whisper wealth and old privilege. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. Inside the car, a gentle jazz melody played, filling the space with familiar warmth. Elijah tapped his fingers lightly on the steering wheel, his mind drifting between memories and the present. It had been a long week, days filled with meetings, decisions, responsibilities at the Pentagon that never seemed to end. But today, all of that faded. Today, he was simply a son, heading home. On the seat beside him, a small white box sat neatly tied with red string, his mother's favorite lemon pie from the bakery she loved. He smiled at the thought of her eyes lighting up when she saw it, at the sound of her voice, warm and teasing, like when he was a boy. Grace Carter had always been his anchor, the steady hand in a world often uncertain. The houses grew more familiar as he turned onto Summit Drive, a street lined with tall oaks just beginning to shed their autumn leaves. The air was crisp, tinged with the scent of fall. Elijah felt something stir in his chest, not quite unease, but something close. This neighborhood, as beautiful as it was, had always carried a subtle message. You don't belong here. But his mother had made it home after his father passed, and he respected that. He checked the rear view mirror, brushing the thought aside. No cars behind him. No rush, He was looking forward to a quiet evening, to the stories his mother would tell, to sitting on the porch like they used to. He adjusted the volume of the music slightly and let out a long breath. It was in these small moments, away from the uniform, away from titles and duties, that Elijah felt most himself. Not Colonel Carter, not the strategist, the soldier, but Elijah, the man who had dreamed big, who had made it out, who had given everything for his country. He didn't see the flashing red and blue lights at first. It wasn't until they pierced the rearview mirror, sudden and sharp, that his brows furrowed. His foot eased off the gas. A familiar weight settled on his chest. I wasn't speeding, he murmured. Still, he pulled over, as he always did, carefully, deliberately. The engine off. The window rolled halfway down. Hands at 10 and 2. Old habits. Old fears. As the patrol car stopped behind him, Elijah took a deep breath, steadying himself. This was supposed to be a peaceful drive home. But sometimes, home could feel a world away. The air was still, but Elijah Carter could feel the storm brewing. The patrol car behind him had come to a sharp halt, its red and blue lights flashing violently, shattering the calm of Summit Drive. Elijah glanced at his rearview mirror, watching the door swing open with force. A man stepped out broad-shouldered, mid-40s, his hand already resting on his holster. Elijah's jaw tightened slightly, his hand steady on the steering wheel. He had been here before, not here exactly, but in situations just like this. A black man in an expensive car, in the wrong neighborhood, under the wrong eyes. Stay calm, he reminded himself quietly. You've done nothing wrong. The officer approached with quick, heavy steps, his eyes scanning the BMW as if it were a stolen artifact. He stopped at the driver's window, leaning in with a mixture of authority and suspicion. "License and registration," Wilson barked. No greeting, no explanation. Elijah met his gaze, calm but firm. "Of course. Officer, may I ask why I'm being stopped?" Wilson smirked. "You don't get to ask questions here. You're in the wrong place, at the wrong time." Elijah's chest tightened. He reached slowly for the glove compartment, pulling out his license and the registration papers. As he handed them over, his voice remained level. "I'm on my way to visit my mother. She lives just down this street." Wilson took the papers, glancing at them briefly, then tossing them back into Elijah's lap without care. "Your mother lives here," he sneered. "I doubt that." Elijah felt the heat rise in his neck, but he swallowed it. Decades of discipline kept him grounded. He had served in war zones, negotiated with foreign leaders, but this felt more dangerous than all of it. "Officer, I've complied with your request. If there's no further issue, I'd like to be on my way." But Wilson wasn't finished. He took a step back, hands still on his holster. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. Elijah froze. "Why?" Wilson's voice grew louder. "I said get out. Now." Elijah weighed his options. "Stay in the car, risk being dragged out. Step out, risk escalation." There was no good choice, only the hope that his composure would prevail. He unlocked the door, opening it slowly, and stepped out onto the pavement. He stood tall, eyes level with Wilson's, hands visible. "All right, officer," he said. "I'm out of the car." "What now?" Wilson moved in close, invading Elijah's space. His breath was sharp, his eyes burning. "You don't belong here," he spat. "This is a neighborhood for decent folks, not for—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Elijah didn't need to hear the word. He felt it. "This is harassment," Elijah said, his voice steel now. "I will not be intimidated. I'm going to call my attorney." And then he reached, a slow, deliberate motion, his hand moving inside his jacket for his phone. But to Wilson, it wasn't a phone. It was a threat, a challenge, an excuse. "Stop!" Wilson shouted, drawing his weapon in one swift motion. Elijah barely had time to react before the shot rang out. Pain exploded in Elijah's abdomen, white-hot and searing. The force drove him backward against the BMW, his breath stolen from his chest. He collapsed to the ground, the phone slipping from his hand, landing with a dull thud beside him. His eyes widened in disbelief, staring up at the sky as it dimmed above him. Wilson stood over him, gun still raised, face pale now, sweat forming at his brow. "What did you do?" Elijah whispered, blood soaking through his shirt, pooling on the clean pavement. But Wilson didn't answer. He staggered back, radioing in with shaking hands. "Shots fired. Suspect was hostile." He reached for something. I had no choice. The shot echoed through Willow Heights, drawing curtains open, faces peering out from behind glass. Within minutes, 911 calls flooded in. "There's a man on the ground. He's bleeding." "There's a cop standing over him with a gun." An ambulance arrived, sirens blaring, paramedics rushing to Elijah's side. But the damage was done. As they worked to stabilize him, Wilson stood by, his story forming, his fear growing. Then, As a paramedic reached into Elijah's jacket to check for identification, they found it, a military ID, worn but clear. Colonel Elijah Carter, the medic read aloud, eyes wide. Wilson froze. News spread fast. Within hours, the identity of the man shot by police was known nationwide. Not a criminal, not a threat, a decorated Army colonel, home to visit his mother. The Pentagon issued a statement demanding a full investigation. Protests erupted outside the police station. Willow Heights, once a symbol of quiet wealth, became ground zero for a storm of outrage. At Oakmont Medical Center, Grace Carter stood beside her son's bed, her hand holding his, lifeless and cold. Machines beeped around them, a cruel reminder of time running out. Her tears fell silently, her heart breaking with every breath he didn't take. "You were just coming home," she whispered. "Just coming home." And as the night stretched on, the city outside raged, not just for Elijah, but for every life taken too soon, for every home shattered by a bullet born from fear. Elijah Carter's story was no longer his alone. It belonged to a nation forced to confront itself, one shot at a time. The first hours after Colonel Elijah Carter was shot were chaotic. At Oakmont Medical Center, doctors fought to save him, but the bullet had torn through vital organs. Despite their efforts, at 9:17 p.m., Elijah was pronounced dead. The attending surgeon removed his gloves slowly, staring at the floor. They had lost a man, but not just any man a hero. Outside the hospital, word had already begun to spread. By the time the night gave way to dawn, Elijah's name was everywhere. Back in Washington, D.C. The halls of the Pentagon were filled with stunned silence as the news reached them. General Matthew Harris sat at his desk, gripping a report with trembling hands. Colonel Elijah Carter shot and killed by police during a traffic stop. Harris felt the blood drain from his face. Elijah wasn't just another soldier. He was a man Harris had mentored, trusted, admired. A man who had given 30 years of his life to serving his country with honor. He slammed the report down. "Get me the governor of this state," he ordered. And with that, the wheels of military power began to turn. At the Oakmont Police Department, Officer Bradley Wilson sat in a small office, his head in his hands. He hadn't spoken much since the shooting. His body cam, as reported, had been turned off. He claimed it was an accident, but that didn't matter now. Sheriff Douglas Palmer, a seasoned officer himself, knew trouble when he saw it. "We can't cover this," Palmer muttered to his deputy. "This is national." Calls from the governor, from senators, from the Department of Justice, flooded in. Each demanded the same answers. Palmer ordered an immediate internal affairs investigation, but it wouldn't stop there. Federal investigators were already on their way. Within 24 hours, the investigation into Wilson's actions uncovered damning facts. No probable cause for the stop. No weapon found on Elijah, just a phone. Witnesses heard Wilson shout, then fire, no struggle, no warning. And then there was the ID. Colonel. Active duty. Pentagon. The weight of those titles pressed heavily on the small town of Oakmont. News outlets ran constant coverage. Photos of Elijah in uniform, with his mother, at military ceremonies filled screens across the country. Justice for Elijah trended globally. Protests erupted in cities nationwide. Crowds gathered, chanting, holding candles, demanding accountability. At one vigil in Atlanta, a young woman stood on a makeshift stage. My father served with Elijah Carter. He was a leader, a mentor. He didn't deserve to die like this. 3 days after Elijah's death, Grace Carter stood before a crowd outside the Oakmont courthouse. She had aged in days, her face lined with grief but filled with quiet strength. She held up a framed photo of Elijah. "This is my son," she said, voice steady. "He served this country. He believed in its promise." She paused, eyes sweeping over the silent crowd. "And that promise was broken." Her words struck deep. "I do not seek revenge. I seek justice. For Elijah, for every son and daughter taken too soon." General Harris took the podium at a press conference at the Pentagon. "We will not stand by while one of our own is gunned down in the streets of the country he swore to protect." He announced the formation of the Elijah Carter Justice Task Force, aimed at addressing racial bias against military personnel off-duty and strengthening protections. This isn't just about one man. It's about the values we claim to uphold. Under immense pressure, District Attorney Samantha Ortiz announced formal charges. Officer Bradley Wilson is being charged with first-degree murder in the death of Colonel Elijah Carter. Her voice was firm. This was not a mistake. This was not fear. This was an act of prejudice, of abuse of power, and we will prosecute it fully. While many celebrated the charges, some circles resisted. Police unions released statements defending Wilson, calling for support for officers under pressure. But the evidence was clear, and public opinion leaned heavily toward accountability. A journalist on national television summed it up. "This isn't just a trial of one officer. This is a trial of a system." Despite the whirlwind around her, Grace remained focused. She attended every hearing, sat through every meeting. When offered a private settlement, she refused. "No amount of money will bring Elijah back. This isn't about that. It's about truth." The grand jury, after reviewing the evidence witness testimony, forensic reports, and Wilson's inconsistent statements, returned an indictment. Bradley Wilson would stand trial. As news broke, Grace stood before reporters once more. "We are one step closer, but we will not stop until justice is complete." With the indictment in hand, DA Ortiz began assembling her case. Wilson's history of complaints surfaced minor infractions, but a pattern of bias. The 911 calls from neighbors painted a picture of excessive force. And the forensics left no doubt. Elijah never had a weapon. The stage was set. In schools, children learned his name. In military halls, his face hung beside medals of valor. And in the hearts of those who had never met him, Elijah Carter became a symbol not just of what was lost, but of what could be gained through unity and justice. The morning air outside Oakmont County Superior Court was thick with tension. Reporters lined the courthouse steps, cameras flashing, microphones poised. Protesters stood with signs reading, "Justice for Elijah," their voices a steady chant beneath the weight of expectation. Inside, the courtroom was packed. On one side, Officer Bradley Wilson sat at the defense table, pale, eyes fixed on the floor. He was no longer the defiant officer who pulled a trigger without hesitation. Now, he looked like a man haunted by the shadow of what he had done. Across from him sat Grace Carter, dressed in black, her back straight, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Beside her, General Matthew Harris and other military officials stood in silent solidarity. The trial of Officer Bradley Wilson for the murder of Colonel Elijah Carter had begun. District Attorney Samantha Ortiz rose first, her tone deliberate, her gaze unwavering. This case is about power, how it's used, how it's abused, she began. Colonel Elijah Carter survived wars abroad, but he could not survive the hatred in his own backyard. She paused, letting her words sink in. The evidence will show that Officer Wilson didn't act in fear. He acted in bias, in anger, and with intent. This was not a mistake. It was murder. The defense countered with a story of confusion, fear, and a tragic misunderstanding. Officer Wilson was faced with a split-second decision. His attorney argued. He believed his life was in danger. He did what he was trained to do. But the jury remained silent, their faces unreadable, and the battle for justice began. The prosecution called witness after witness, each one unraveling the defense's narrative. Neighbors testified, I heard shouting, then a gunshot. There was no struggle. He wasn't threatening anyone. Forensic experts confirmed the bullet entered from close range. No defensive wounds. No sign of a weapon, just a cell phone. Police trainers took the stand. Wilson violated multiple protocols. His actions were not consistent with any proper use of force guidelines. The courtroom hung on every word. But it was General Harris who delivered one of the most powerful testimonies. Elijah Carter was not just a soldier. He was a man of peace, a mentor, a leader. Harris said, his voice strong, but edged with emotion. To suggest he was a threat dishonors everything he stood for. He looked directly at Wilson. You didn't just take a life. You took a legacy. When Grace Carter took the stand, the room fell silent. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the microphone. Elijah was my son, she began softly. He wasn't perfect, but he was good. He believed in right and wrong. He believed that if you followed the rules, you'd be safe. Her eyes locked with the jurors. He followed every rule that day. He complied. He respected. And still, he was killed. Tears welled in her eyes, but her voice remained firm. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here for truth, for justice. A hush followed her words, heavy with the weight of a mother's grief. Wilson's attorneys tried to mount a defense. They called character witnesses who spoke of his years of service. They argued that Elijah's movement for his phone looked like a threat. They played on the fear officers face in uncertain situations. But the jury had seen the evidence. The missing body cam footage. The history of complaints against Wilson for aggressive behavior. The 911 calls that contradicted his story. Each argument crumbled under the weight of truth. Ortiz stood once more, her voice filled with conviction. Colonel Carter didn't have to die. He died because one man saw his skin color as a weapon. He died because power was abused. She turned to the jury. This is your moment. To say that this life mattered. To say that no one, no matter their badge, is above the law. The defense pleaded for leniency. Officer Wilson made a mistake. They insisted. A tragic, split-second mistake. But the room had already made up its mind. After 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned. The judge's gavel called for order as the forewoman stood. Has the jury reached a unanimous verdict? Yes, Your Honor. She took a breath. We, the jury, find the defendant, Bradley Wilson, guilty of first-degree murder. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Wilson slumped in his seat, his face ashen. Grace closed her eyes, tears falling silently. She wasn't smiling, but for the first time, her heart felt light. Justice had been heard. Weeks later, at the sentencing hearing, D.A. Ortiz requested the death penalty. This wasn't just a crime. It was a betrayal, she said. A betrayal of public trust, of humanity, of the values we hold dear. Wilson's attorneys begged for life imprisonment, citing his family, his past, his supposed remorse. The judge, an experienced man, took a long pause before delivering his sentence. "Officer Wilson," he said, "your actions were deliberate, fueled by prejudice, and utterly unjustifiable. For the murder of Colonel Elijah Carter, this court sentences you to death." The sentence made headlines. Some hailed it as justice. Others questioned its severity. But for Grace, for General Harris, and for millions who had watched, it was more than a verdict. It was a statement that Elijah Carter's life had value, that justice could prevail, that one man's story could ignite a nation. And though the fight for change was far from over, in that moment, the truth had spoken loud and clear. The courthouse had emptied, but the echoes of the verdict still reverberated across the nation. Colonel Elijah Carter was gone, but in his absence, he had awakened something powerful. His name had become more than a symbol of loss. It had become a rallying cry for a country struggling to reconcile its promises with its reality. The sentence was final. Officer Bradley Wilson would face death for his crime. The decision was rare, almost unheard of for a police officer. And while many cheered, others paused, reflecting on the deeper meaning of what had just occurred. Across the country, people reacted with a mix of relief, vindication, and uncertainty. In cities large and small, candlelight vigils honored Elijah's life. In New York, Atlanta, Chicago, and Los Angeles, streets filled with marchers chanting "Justice for Elijah" and "No more names." His face appeared on murals, his story shared in churches, schools, and community centers. But amid the celebration of justice served, there were questions. Was this a turning point or an exception? In Washington, D.C., pressure mounted for systemic change. The Elijah Carter Act, proposed just days after the sentencing, aimed to enact national reforms in policing. Mandatory body camera activation during all civilian interactions, with severe penalties for disabling them. A federal database to track officers with histories of misconduct. Nationwide racial bias training and psychological evaluations for all law enforcement personnel. Independent review boards to oversee police-involved shootings. The bill, once seen as too ambitious, now gained bipartisan support, fueled by public outcry and Elijah's high-profile death. Senator Rachel Vaughn, who introduced the bill, spoke passionately on the Senate floor. "This is not about one officer. It's about a system that allowed him to believe he could act without consequence. Elijah Carter's death was a tragedy, but it can be a catalyst for change." The bill passed the House in record time and moved swiftly through the Senate. In military circles, Elijah's death struck especially deep. The Department of Defense, under pressure from both the public and its own ranks, announced sweeping changes to protect service members off duty, enhanced legal support for military personnel facing discrimination, partnerships with civilian agencies to improve civil-military relations, programs aimed at addressing implicit bias in communities surrounding military bases. At a press conference, General Matthew Harris stood with fellow leaders and delivered a clear message. Elijah Carter was one of us, and we failed to protect him. No more. The military will not only honor his service, but will fight to ensure that what happened to him never happens again. Through it all, Grace Carter remained at the heart of the movement. Her grief had not faded, but it had transformed into a relentless drive for change. She traveled the country, speaking at rallies, colleges, and government hearings. In Oakland, she stood before a crowd of thousands. "My son gave everything to this country," she said, her voice unwavering. "And it took him, not in battle, but here, on a quiet street, because someone saw his skin before they saw his soul." Her words resonated deeply. Grace founded the Elijah Carter Foundation, dedicated to supporting families affected by police violence, providing scholarships for minority youth pursuing careers in law, public service, and the military, funding research into policing practices and community safety. The foundation quickly became a powerful force, drawing support from activists, lawmakers, and ordinary citizens who had grown tired of waiting for change. Elijah's story made its way into the heart of American culture. Documentaries chronicled his life in the trial. Artists painted murals in cities across the country, depicting Elijah in uniform, eyes forward, unbroken. Books and films inspired by his life sparked national conversations about race, justice, and identity. In schools, his name joined the ranks of other civil rights figures, a reminder that the fight for equality was ongoing. Elijah was laid to rest in Arlington National Cemetery, among heroes. Thousands attended, many who had never met him but felt as though they knew him through his story. The funeral was both a mourning and a celebration, a tribute to a life lived with honor and a life taken unjustly. General Harris delivered the eulogy. Elijah Carter was a soldier, a son, a leader. He stood for the best of us. And though he is gone, his mission continues. As Grace accepted the folded flag, tears streamed down her face, but she stood tall, knowing her son had changed the world. Justice for Elijah was a milestone, but not the destination. His case inspired dozens of investigations into other police shootings, some reopened, others newly scrutinized. The Department of Justice established a task force to address systemic bias at the federal level. Communities took steps toward healing dialogues between police and residents, efforts to rebuild trust, slow but real progress. At the entrance to Willow Heights, where Elijah was shot, a statue was unveiled 1 year later. It depicted Elijah standing tall, in uniform, looking ahead. Beneath it, engraved in stone, Colonel Elijah Carter, a soldier for justice. His voice still speaks. And it did. Through the laws passed in his name. Through the lives changed by his story. Through the hearts stirred by his sacrifice. Because one man's life, taken in hate, ignited a fire for justice that would not be extinguished. The courtroom battles were over. The chants in the streets had quieted, replaced by a thoughtful stillness. But for Grace Carter, the silence was never empty. Her son, Colonel Elijah Carter, had been laid to rest with full honors. His flag-draped coffin now rested beneath the green hills of Arlington National Cemetery, among heroes who had given everything for a country that promised liberty and justice. Yet Elijah's story did not end there. In the months following the trial, Grace found herself reflecting not only on her loss, but on what her son had stood for. He had believed in the power of service, the strength of community, and the dignity of every human being. Elijah never gave up on this country. She often told those who asked how she found the strength to continue. And neither will I. She turned her grief into action. Through the Elijah Carter Foundation, Grace began supporting families who had experienced similar tragedies. She sat with mothers who, like her, had lost sons and daughters to fear and hate. She listened, she cried, and together they began to heal. Elijah's story had sparked national reform, but real change was slow. Still, there were signs of hope. Police departments adopted new accountability measures. Schools introduced curriculums on justice and equality, often using Elijah's story as a case study in courage and sacrifice. Communities once divided by fear began to hold dialogues, opening the door for understanding. Grace traveled often, speaking not only of what had been lost but what could still be gained. Justice, she would say, is not a verdict. It's a commitment to each other, to truth, to doing better. In the quiet moments, Grace would sit on her porch, the same porch where she had once waited for Elijah to arrive with her favorite lemon pie. The chair beside her was empty now, but she often imagined him there, smiling, listening to her stories. She would write letters to him, letters filled with updates on the world he left behind. Elijah, the laws are changing. People are listening. Your name is everywhere. My boy. You've woken them up. Her grief had not vanished, but it had softened, shaped by purpose. The world moved forward, but Elijah's legacy remained a guiding light. In parks, murals of his face stood tall. In libraries, scholarships funded by his foundation gave young dreamers the chance to lead. And in the hearts of those who heard his story, something stirred a belief that one life could indeed change many. Grace often reminded others and herself that healing was not forgetting. It's remembering with love. It's choosing to live the way Elijah did, with strength, with grace, and with hope. Because even in the deepest sorrow, there is room for light, and Elijah Carter's light still shines. Life is fragile, and too often, it's tested by forces beyond our control. But in that fragility lies immense strength, the strength to stand for what's right, even when the world seems unjust. Colonel Elijah Carter's story reminds us that dignity, honor, and truth don't fade with tragedy. They echo through the lives we touch and the change we inspire. We are not defined by how we fall, but by how we rise, how we choose compassion over hate, courage over fear, and action over silence. True justice is not only about courts or verdicts, it lives in everyday choices to respect one another, to challenge prejudice, and to build a world where every life is valued equally. No matter how dark the moment, there's always light in those who refuse to give up. We all carry the power to create that light. And in doing so, we honor those we've lost, not with anger, but with purpose. Life is a gift, fleeting but full of meaning. Live it boldly, stand for others, and never doubt that one voice, one act of kindness, one life can change everything.